Starting tomorrow, the Trump administration will impose a 10% tariff on China. Now, this in addition to a 25% levy on imports from Canada and Mexico. Joining us now live to discuss this is Trump's China strategy is John Sitilides, the senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and former government contractor for the U.S. State Department. John, thank you so much for sitting down with us here today. Now, speaking to reporters at the White House, President Trump today said that the tariffs he's imposing are not a negotiating tool. He specifically mentioned that China is killing hundreds of thousands of Americans every year with fentanyl. Now, what does this statement say about his administration's approach to how they handle the Chinese Communist Party?
I don't know that I'm going to take at face value that it's not a negotiating tool in the long run. Right now, I think President Trump is very serious about imposing some type of punitive measure on the Chinese government and the Chinese economy because the US government has believed through administrations, through Biden, through the first Trump administration, that China has a deliberate drug warfare strategy using fentanyl and, of course, providing the precursor chemicals to the Mexican drug cartels to contaminate American society. It's all here in this book, Unrestricted Warfare. And drug warfare is one of the components of the People's Liberation Army being used against the United States. And the Chinese Communist Party controls every aspect of the economy, of the society. They know who manufactures these precursor chemicals. They know how they're being exported. And there are some China analysts who will even point to the fact that there are tax rebates and other government incentives for these fentanyl precursor chemical manufacturers to get these chemicals into the hands of the cartels, into the American economy, into our society, to begin to destroy and corrode our youth and our most desperate citizens.
So, yeah, we're definitely seeing some action taken there. And at his confirmation hearing, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said that China is leveraging its financial surplus to fund its military. How important are economic measures in addressing the challenges posed by the Chinese Communist Party?
That's going to be uncertain, Jack. The Chinese Communist Party has completely prioritized the Chinese military over almost all other aspects of Chinese governance. And we know that Xi Jinping has ordered the People's Liberation Army to be prepared to invade Taiwan by 2027. Not that it's necessarily going to, but to have the capability to do so, that they intend to have what they call a fully modernized Chinese military by 2035, and to have a quote unquote world-class Chinese military by 2049, which is the centennial of the Chinese Communist Party seizing power in Beijing. And by world-class, most analysts will interpret that as being able to project power on a global scale to match that of the United States military. So unfortunately, China's society will continue to suffer. Chinese economy, Chinese innovation in many sectors will suffer, except for one sector, Jack, and that's technology. Because the Chinese understand, as do we here in the United States, that technological supremacy will direct the global economy of the 21st century. So I think there may not be much we can do economically to deal with this attention that's being paid to the Chinese military, but I think there are very strong instruments that we have to work more closely with allies such as Japan, the Philippines, Thailand, South Korea, Taiwan, to make even the notion of a Chinese invasion or a naval blockade around Taiwan or further aggression against the Philippines or against Japan to be far more painful to the Chinese military and, of course, to the Chinese Communist Party than the benefits of any such military operations.
John, part of President Trump's plan, we know, his economic plan, as he outlined during his campaign, is to reduce reliance on foreign countries, particularly authoritarian regimes like China. So when it comes to supply chain issues, could the latest tariffs make America less dependent on Chinese manufacturing in the long term?
That remains to be seen. I mean, we don't know if these tariffs will be in place for weeks or months, whether there'll be some type of a grand bargain between President Trump and Chinese Communist Party General Secretary Xi Jinping. So a lot of this remains quite uncertain. I think what's going to be important here is to decouple the American defense industrial base from dependence on China. There was a shocking report that came out about a year or so ago, Jack, that demonstrated that almost all of our major American defense contractors are utterly dependent on Chinese manufacturers for ball bearings, for magnets, for semiconductors, for chips, and for a whole host of components and materials, not to build our larger systems, but for the thousands and tens of thousands of small parts that are so essential for full assembly here in the United States. And of course, we learned during the COVID lockdowns that much of our pharmaceutical industry is dependent on the manufacturing of precursor chemicals in China, as we mentioned before with fentanyl. And in the event of a crisis, say around the Philippines or the South China Sea or Taiwan, the Chinese government could all of a sudden declare that there are a number of disruptions in the supply chains of these essential pharmaceuticals that could lead to the deaths of thousands, if not tens of thousands, of ailing Americans who are dependent on weeks or months of supplies of these drugs that are dependent on China. So I think in these types of national security, medical, and health and well-being industries, we will continue to try to decouple from Chinese factory floor and industrial-based manufacturing, but we really need to see to what extent this is going to influence, say, the consumption of electronic goods, T-shirts, furniture. I mean, these are not essential to the national well-being. They're more consumer products and amusement products.
Now, China is grappling, as we know, with a sluggish economy marked by a real estate crisis and declining consumer spending. With Trump's tariffs in place, how might China react to all this?
Well, that remains to be seen going forward because China has already been responding. It started under the Biden administration with the holdup, the disruption, and the prohibition of the sale of critical rare earth elements that are vital to our increasingly technologically based economy here, Jack. So I believe it was maybe in September or October, the Chinese Communist Party banned the export of a rare earth element called antimony, which is required to build nuclear weapons, night goggles, electric vehicle batteries, and ammunition. And that was followed up by the prohibition on the sale of gallium and germanium, which is essential for the manufacturing of semiconductors and other advanced technological products here in the United States. So that's already begun. Will we see other types of retaliatory measures, perhaps tariffs on U.S. farm exports to China, as the Chinese Communist Party undertook in 2018? Possibly. But I think there's a larger context here that we need to be mindful of, and that is that the U.S. economy is not all that dependent on the export of goods, except perhaps for farm products to China, which is a major part of the U.S. agricultural sector. But we export about $150 billion worth of goods and services to China every year. China exports about $500 billion worth of goods to the United States. So a tariff retaliation or a significant prolonged trade war would be far more deleterious to the Chinese economy than it would be to the US economy. We're a much more resilient and self-dependent and autonomous economy here in the United States. So we're blessed by that. And I think that China wants to be very careful to what extent they're willing to retaliate. They've already begun to demonstrate it. I think they need to show face and to demonstrate resolve to their own people and to demonstrate that Xi Jinping is not going to be bullied by Donald Trump, as the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and the Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum are looking to demonstrate. But at some point, I think all three of these economies will recognize they are far more dependent on access to the massive American market than they are on the ability to extract goods and reduce tariffs from the Trump administration.
Fascinating insights as always. John Sitilides, thank you very much for your insights here today.
Thank you for having me, Jack.